Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? I feel like you must be better than that, surely. We're here for such a wonderful event. You're feeling better than that, right? Yeah. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone who's watching online. My name is Aidan Flax-Clark. I'm the Director of Live from NYPL. And it is my great honor to introduce the amazing American artist and photographer, Dawoud Bey. Yeah, that's right. He's here to talk about his book, Elegy, which is published by our friends at Aperture. Oh, it cut out for a second. Elegy brings together 3 of Dawoud's landscape series, Night Coming Tenderly Black, In This Here Place, and Stony the Road. And he will speak about it with Siddhartha Mitter, who we are extremely lucky to have with us tonight as well, and who wrote a fantastic piece about Dawoud in the New York Times last November. Did you guys see that? And it also talked about the show Elegy, which is at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which closes in a few days. So after you're done here, hop on a train and go see it before. It's a truly beautiful piece of work. The book is for sale over there. I very much encourage you to purchase a copy. Dawoud will be signing it over there after the event. All proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library, and you'll be a better person for buying it. Now, I'm going to tell you a secret. But the deal is, after I tell you the secret, you have to tell everyone about the secret, because we don't want it to be a secret any longer. Do you know that the New York Public Library has not 1, but 2 world-class photography collections? Who knows that? See? All right, that's why it's a secret, but we don't want it to be any more. We have here in this building and at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture 2 incredible photography collections, something like 1 million images between the 2 divisions. Yeah, that's right. Any photographers or students of photography in the room? All right, so I've made your lives better now, right? Because you know about these collections. Right here in the Wallach division, which is up on the 3rd floor of this building, which was created in 1980. There are about 500,000 photographs by about 6,000 photographers. And there's everything from commercial photography, industrial photography, scientific work, press and media photos, and of course, artistic photography. And then uptown at the Schomburg Center, there's another 500,000 photographs. And the Schomburg's photography division documents the history and culture of people of African descent worldwide, as well as work of photographers of African descent. And the collections range from the 18th century to now. And as I learned from the Schomburg's current brilliant photography curator, Dalila Scruggs, they actually have incredible holdings of Dawoud's work. In 1982, one of Dalila's predecessors, Deb Willis, a trailblazing curator of photography at the Schomburg, as well as a brilliant artist in her own right, purchased Harlem, USA from Dawoud, I think just like 2 years after he made it. And I think that he can confirm, but I believe Dawoud said it was one of the earliest acquisitions of work anywhere. And a whole lot more. Now, how do you access these collections? Surely it must cost a lot of money. You have to become a member. It's very complicated. There are forms, triplicate, the whole thing. Incorrect. You need one thing, your New York Public Library card. It is free to everyone in this room because you all have a New York Public Library card, obviously, right? Because, like, what kind of New Yorker would you be if you didn't have a New York Public Library card? We would ask you to kindly leave. So check them out. Really, truly some gems in our collections that are filled with many gems. I want to tell you about a few other events we have at Live from NYPL. Next week, the fantastic musician Christian McBride will be here. Yeah, it's going to be great. He's going to be talking, not playing, but he's a pretty good talker, so I think it'll still be fantastic. In March, former Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer will be here. Marilyn Robinson will be here. Later on down the road, Emily Wilson, the great translator of Aperture, will be here. And in May, Jamaica Kincaid and Kara Walker will be here as well, plus many, many more. So please join us for those. You can go to nypl.org/live to check them out. You can get on our newsletter to get notified about it right away. And it's going to be good stuff. So we're going to turn it over to Dawoud and Siddhartha in a minute. You all have note cards on your seats. Dawoud will be happy to answer a couple of questions at the end of tonight's talk. You can write them down, and some of my colleagues will come by and pick them up from you. If you're watching online, you can put your questions in the chat, or you can email publicprograms@nypl.org. We want to hear from you wherever you are, so please send us some questions. We'll bring them up to them, and they'll get to a couple. All right, without further ado, let's give it up for Siddhartha Mitter and Dawoud Bey.
Well, good evening, everybody. How y'all doing? Thank you to the New York Public Library. Thank you to Aperture. Thank you, Dawoud, for inviting me to be in conversation with you. This is a short program, so we're going to go straight into it. But just so that everybody has the same degree of information, probably everybody here knows a little bit of this, but you might not know all of it. Elegy, the book that we have here, which was published in connection with the exhibition by the same name at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, beautifully and brilliantly curated by Valerie Cassell Oliver. Absolutely. And which you can see, as Aidan said, for another week if you get down to Richmond, and it's well worth it. Elegy contains 3 landscape-based series. One of them, Night Coming Tenderly Black, Dawoud shot in Northeast Ohio around sites that connect to or express something about the Underground Railroad. Then came In This Here Place, which he made in Louisiana, particularly at the Evergreen Plantation, around sites that connect to or express something about the experience of enslavement. And then came Stony the Road, which premieres in the show in Richmond, and photographed in Richmond around a site that connects to the early time of enslavement and the arrival of enslaved Africans. All of these works together have been characterized by many writers, myself and many others, as a turn for you to landscape work, whereas for many years, decades, you were best known for the figure, the portrait, whether in the street or in conceptual projects. But what people might not know is that you were pulled into this historical work and even into this landscape work through an earlier project in Birmingham, Alabama. And that project, while it resulted also in conceptual portraiture, was also what pulled you into history. And as you have told me and others, you can't understand this work here without going to Birmingham first.
Yeah, because well, before I respond to your question, just let me say thank you to all of you for coming out, and the Public Library, New York Public Library, and Aperture for hosting and sponsoring this event. But yeah, the significant shift for me begins with the Birmingham project, which, while it is indeed conceptualized around the portrait, is very much the first project in which I began to contend with this idea of how does one represent the past in the contemporary moment? How does one collapse the past and present into a kind of liminal experience that is both, i.e., it's clearly made in this moment, but deeply and richly evocative of the history that it chooses to represent. So that work is the first work in which I began to contend with history as the subject. The idea of place itself has always been central to the narrative of my work. And the first group of photographs in which the work is not conceived around what we would call the portrait is actually the Harlem Redux work, which is work about the urban landscape and the changing landscape of Harlem, New York, due to forces of globalization and gentrification. So the Harlem Redux work begins to move me away from the portrait, while the Birmingham work, while it is still portrait, begins to move me to a place of liminality, engaging history through the past and present simultaneously. So it's both of those projects, and what I came away from both of those projects with that then lead to the 3 projects that followed.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about what called you to Birmingham, because the Birmingham project is work that you make in the sense of making the photographs in 2012, but it's a process that you begin even years before that, and you felt a call to Birmingham, where until then you had never set foot.
Yeah, I had never stepped foot in Birmingham before, and the way you frame it as being called to make that work is very true, because that work came out of a moment that I could only describe as an epiphany. There was a book that was published in 1964 by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was known to those who are familiar with them as SNCC. And SNCC published this book in 1964 as a fundraising vehicle for the organization. And it was a book of and about the civil rights movement, with photographs by a wide range of photographers. And SNCC enlisted the writer and playwright Lorraine Hansberry to write a text that would weave these pictures together into book form. And there were a lot of horrific photographs in that book. There were lynching photographs in that book. There were photographs in that book that I often characterize as all of the things that my parents had tried to shield me from up until that moment. And my mother and father actually got the book when they went to hear James Baldwin speak at our church in Jamaica, Queens, where I grew up. And after Baldwin's talk, they were selling that book. And they brought it home and left it in some conspicuous place where I could get at it. They didn't tell me you have to read it, because if they had, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. Just out of youthful defiance, maybe I wouldn't have looked at it. Yeah. But they just left it out. And going through the book, as I said, there were all of these horrific photographs, but one photograph seared its way into my psyche, and it was a photograph of a young black girl laying in a hospital bed with these heavy gauze bandages on her eyes. And that was Sarah Jean Collins, who was the younger sister of Addie Mae Collins, who had been killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church the year before. And I saw that picture, not necessarily intuiting at that moment that the reason it may have taken such deep hold of me was because I was pretty close in age to the girl in the picture. It may have been that, but at any rate, that photograph of that vulnerable, wounded girl just seared its way into my psyche. And at some point, I parked it somewhere, and it receded. But then one morning, decades later, I'm talking 30, 40, maybe even 50 years later, that photograph came rushing back to me. and I had an experience where I literally, early one morning, sat bolt upright in bed. I'm not sure if I really understood what that expression meant until that moment, but I literally sat bolt upright in bed, and what came rushing back was that girl, that picture. And at that point, I felt like I need to go to Birmingham. I need to go to the place where this happened. I need to bear witness to this history. So it was like, that young girl was calling me, because I was in the midst of the class pictures project. I was close to the end of that, not having any real sense of what would come next. And so that moment where that picture of that girl came rushing back pointed me to the work that I've done for over the last 10 years now.
So when the Birmingham project was pulling you towards history, and the Harlem Redux project was opening you towards landscape, and then you receive an invitation to go and make work in and around Cleveland, Ohio, in Northeast Ohio, and you say yes, what did you feel you were looking for at that point in Ohio?
Well, I felt comfortable with the conceptual and formal and the making piece as far as making what would be called landscape-based work. And when I was invited by the Front Triennial to come to Cleveland, make work, and to participate in the triennial, I knew that I wanted to continue to engage this idea of history. I didn't want to go there and do something else. I didn't want to accept the invitation and be knocked off course. So I told them I would accept if I could find a meaningful piece of African American history in Cleveland and Northeastern Ohio that I could make the subject of the work. And I quickly realized that Cleveland's proximity to Lake Erie was the reason that that region figured very significantly in the history of what came to be called the Underground Railroad. Once I realized that, I accepted the invitation and then began to do research around the Underground Railroad. Still not having any clear sense of what I might make of it, but accepting the invitation as a challenge to kind of figure that out.
I don't think I've ever asked you, actually. I mean, Richmond, we know why that location. It was the trail on which the enslaved people walked. Louisiana, Evergreen Plantation, we know why that location. But in Ohio, how did you actually choose the locations that appear in the photographs?
It's interesting because unlike Louisiana and unlike Richmond, where that history is still physically present, in Cleveland, a lot of that history has been built over. But in Hudson, Ohio, about 45 minutes outside of Cleveland, where the abolitionist John Brown had his house, Hudson, Ohio was a large abolitionist community. And it was on the pathway to Cleveland and then Lake Erie. So I started doing research. All of this history-based work is very research-based. Even Birmingham, I did a lot of research about that moment that I wanted to make work about. I still have an encyclopedia worth of all kinds of information about Birmingham, because I feel that I need to know deeply the place in which I'm working rather than to just go there, make work, and then leave. So I really need to understand the history that I'm trying to invoke and evoke in the work. So there were In Cleveland proper, there is one particular site that remains from that history and had been basically surrounded by the university, but this one house remains, the Cozad Bates house. So in Cleveland, I started by photographing the Cozad Bates house. And then research led me to Hudson, Ohio, some of which those houses that were used as what came to be called Underground Railroad stations. Some of them are designated landmarks or historic sites. Only a handful. And because I wasn't looking to specifically document those sites so much as I was looking to imagine this landscape of fugitivity that included those sites. You know, not wanting to make a documentary type of work, whatever that genre means, kind of freed me to look at the landscape more broadly. And I ended up looking at the landscape around and in proximity to some of these known sites. Because the Underground Railroad of necessity was secret. Nobody would ever know what the literal path of movement through that landscape was, which gave me the freedom to imagine what that path might have been, using bodies of water, using John Brown's tannery, and then John Brown's son had a house, Orvin Brown, and looking at those sites, and then looking at the landscape around those sites.
So what did the experience of that research, being in those sites, and then starting to bring those sites into the frame and into the work, what did that tell you, and maybe this is an emotional question, not an analytic question, what did that tell you about the Underground Railroad?
Well, you know, I don't make the work while I'm making the work from a place of emotion. It's a making challenge to figure out how to both formally and materially shape the experience. All of the emotions of the experience are the reason that I'm there. They're not with me when I'm making this work, because I don't think, in the most literal sense, emotions don't tell you how to make anything. They give you a reason for showing up, but they don't tell you how to make anything. And for that work in particular, I needed to find a way that materially alluded to the thing that I wanted to describe, with this idea of fugitivity under cover of darkness. And I was led to that through Roy DeCarava's photograph, for one, this idea of the black subject, the black narrative, and the blackness of the photographic object, what that might be. And then secondly, Langston Hughes' poem, Dream Variation, that ends with this couplet, night coming tenderly, black like me. There's such a universe in those words, night coming tenderly, black like me, which allowed me to imagine the nighttime, the darkness, this blackness as a kind of tender embrace around these once enslaved African Americans moving through that landscape, and then making the photograph, the prints, as a kind of visual equivalent or a visual realization of this idea of blackness, fugitivity under cover of darkness, because the photographs were not made under those conditions.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's my reimagining and finding a way to formally and materially make this thing that I'm imagining, anchored in very real history, which is the important thing. It has to be anchored and real history, because that's the history that I'm trying to call you back to.
Now, quiet as it's kept, you do have a long-standing relationship with the American landscape tradition in both painting and photography, from your studies, from various mentors, and from your own critical understanding and appreciation of that tradition. And maybe we could bring that in. Say you didn't come into this without some arms.
Because even as I was making work that would be considered portraits, my interest in the broader history of photography and art certainly extends beyond that. And I'm very familiar with all of those photographers who have made work within and have kind of established the language of the landscape photograph as a genre within photography. So part of what this work is about also is wanting to begin to have a conversation with that history, this whole history of the landscape, and to, I guess, insert into that history the things that I want to use that genre, if you want to call it a genre, to talk about something that's not the kind of Emersonian nature of the landscape, but to actually identify within the American landscape a very deep and rich Black presence in the history, and a history that is embedded in that landscape, to bring meaning to the landscape through the now invisible, but to my mind, still visible Black presences within that landscape. And then to try to realize that, to make photographs about the invisible, but still present Black bodies within the American landscape, to provoke yet a different conversation within that genre.
We could say, on one hand, that it's an intervention that you're proposing in the American landscape tradition, but there's also maybe a theory of progress or an optimism in it, because you're saying that the American landscape photography or painting does not need to be inherently imperialistic, conquest-based, supremacist, and so forth.
Yes, I think definitely we can see the ambition of the work as an expansion of that history, which, the majority of work that I came up knowing, photography by Black photographers in particular, was centered on the Black subject, the Black body, the Black figure, and there hasn't been a very deep practice around the landscape on the part of Black photographers. So I want to bring that to the conversation as well, to propose yet another way that we might engage with the landscape that still, in some ways, very much uses the form of the landscape, and then using that form to a very different end.
When you talked about those horrific pictures that were in that book, the lynching photographs, the photograph of Ms. Collins, the other photographs that document violence, and then we can also see on the other side of the ledger the struggle photographs, the movement photographs, the heroic photographs. What relationship would you say exists between this body of work that you've made and those polarities?
That's a very interesting question, Siddhartha. And I think they are related very much to those photographs in that book that engage the idea of the black trauma that was endured as a consequence of the resistance of the civil rights movement. And yet, of course, they don't reveal that, but they are very much loaded with the history of that, you know, because the photographs from Richmond, Virginia, and the film work, you know, there were upwards of 350,000 enslaved African Americans who were walked into their first encounter, their first horrific encounter with slavery and with America on that very site. So it's an interesting challenge because the plantation landscape as well was a site of horror that the enslaved themselves had to construct for their own containment, and yet it's now mute. So I think there's a very clear relationship between them. The question is, how do we, or how do I really engage that history in the contemporary moment? You know, how do I bear witness, you know, to a past that we can no longer see? You know, I can't, I'm not interested in making recreations or populating the landscapes with recreations of some of these moments. So for me, the landscapes themselves hold all of that history that I was inspired to return to through my initial encounter with that book, The Movement. And of course, you know, in the broader arc of my life, before I became a photographer, I was a very young activist. I was very active as a teenager in the Black Panther Party and in a number of movements. So part of the answer to that question lies, I think, in the broader arc of my work and in the broader arc of my life.
As you move from the Ohio pictures to the Louisiana pictures to the Richmond pictures, each of these series has its own site or sites, it has its own identity, it has its own cohesion. But each of them, they all participate in a body that is forming, and there has to be a learning, a perfecting that takes place from a craft point of view as you go through that. And so I wonder what it is that the Ohio project taught the Louisiana project, taught the Richmond project. What is the development that takes place? And maybe this is a technical or formal question, but as you go through these.
Well, I think certainly between the Ohio photograph, and in which I ranged far and wide, across Cleveland, and then across Hudson, Ohio, which gave me a lot of room to look, see, think, and feel. And then the Richmond work, which takes place in a very, very narrow space of a trail of which only a 3-mile section survives, and only about a 1.5, 2-mile section can be physically and continuously engaged. So the challenge for me is how does one, in a very seemingly truncated landscape like that, how does one go about reinventing the picture-making process? How does one go about establishing a constantly shifting sense of place? One of the things that has guided all 3 of those projects is that the work is made from an eye-level vantage point, which is meant to approximate and suggest the ways in which that landscape might have appeared through the eyes of those enslaved African Americans who were moving through the landscape. So that gives me a sense of trying to make work in which there is both a rich sense of the place geographically, but also materially, to be able to, in the photograph, feel what that place feels like as much as what it looks like. The other thing about this work, beginning with the Birmingham work, is that all of the projects have been made in black and white. Harlem Redux was made in color. It's a very contemporary set of circumstances that I want you to think about. You know, like the transformation of that community is happening now. And I want to make some large-scale color photograph to signify the nowness in which this is happening. With the other works, I want them to pull you back into history. And black and white, of course, is the material of photography's past. So this material decision to use black and white as opposed to color, which would be a conspicuously contemporary way of making a certain kind of photographic object. You know, the material piece of it is hugely important to me. And from a framing standpoint, a making standpoint, compositional, you know, the other challenge in all 3 of these, because it did exist, is to not reveal anything of the contemporary present world in the frame of the photograph. Much the way, you know, if you think about photographers like, especially within the landscape tradition, someone like Ansel Adams, who's making this photograph of this majestic landscape that we need to preserve, and it's absolutely, it looks uninhabited, even though if you turn around, the parking lot is right behind you. You know?
Yeah.
So the narrative comes out of what you choose to not show as much as what you choose to show. And that's because all of the work, including Ansel Adams' work and any photographer, any artist, is really about the visualization of a particular idea. And how does one wield the tools and the medium to make something visible that's a representation of that idea. The same subject could yield something radically different. But all of these projects are my ideas that I want the viewer to believe and invest in and to have a deeply resonant response to.
You've talked about the importance of research and of repeated visits. You visit Birmingham for 5, 6, 7 years before you make that work. You, as much as possible, had these advanced visits. Let's go straight to the Richmond project, which is the most recent one. And I'd love for you to describe a little bit what happened during the course of your Richmond visits. Who were the kinds of people that you met? Who were the community people in Richmond? What kind of work were you trying to tune into? Even if it doesn't reflect directly, formally in the images, but that is orienting you as you do the work there?
Yeah, I think my first visit to Richmond, I think, was 2019, maybe, when Valerie invited me to come and see the trail, but to also get a sense of Richmond, Virginia as an historical site and location. And that meant everything from visiting St. John's Church, where the Second Constitutional Convention was held, where John Henry uttered those "Give me liberty" or
Patrick
"Give
Henry.
me
Yeah,
Patrick
yeah,
Henry."
yeah.
Uttered that phrase. It really means just getting a deep sense of where I am and where I am about to begin thinking about making work. When I visited the trail for the first time and saw how narrow this space was that runs parallel to the James River, I actually started making some very, very preliminary photographs with the camera in my phone. Just trying to see basically how this landscape translates into two-dimensional form with no color. Because standing in it, that's not the work I want to make. That's the basis for the work. So I start by making these very preliminary pictures to see how this translates. I start to construct what the narrative might be, how important the water, the James River, is to the narrative, and how many different ways I can make photographs in this space and periodically not lose sight of the water, because that's how this whole narrative begins to unfold. And then while I'm doing that, because I never want to work in a vacuum, I began to meet people in Richmond who were already doing work on the ground in terms of trying to draw attention to the African American piece of the American history embedded in Richmond, and visiting the Evergreen Cemetery in Richmond, which was a black cemetery that had been allowed to become, unkempt and overgrown, and meeting folks at the Elegba Society, Elegba Folk Society, who had been trying to draw public attention to the need to recognize and preserve the trail as a kind of sacred site, meeting people like Anna Edwards from the Civil War Museum there, who were trying to amplify the African American story within Richmond and Virginia, within the history of the Civil War. So just trying to make sure that I'm in conversation with the larger community that has already undertaken this work, which my work will ultimately, at some point, be in conversation with. But it's important for me to not, both from a research standpoint and from a credibility and integrity standpoint, to not just parachute into these places, leave, and then come back and make the work.
So we're getting the cue to go to Q&A, and if somebody wants to start bringing me some of the note cards with questions so we can pick one or two. But while that happens, let's talk a little bit about sound and music. We want to make sure to get that in here. You made a film with the Louisiana project, a three-channel video, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, three-channel
with original music by Imani Uzuri. And then for Richmond, you have a two-channel video that appears kind of as a diptych, which is quite fascinating because it takes the viewer along single tracking shot along this trail, and it is accompanied by a very remarkable piece of sound or music design in which you worked with a choreographer.
Yeah, Gaynell Sherrod.
Professor Gaynell Sherrod of Virginia, of VCU. And I think it's worth talking a little bit about the challenge that you set to her because she had never done anything like this.
Yeah, well, the photographs are kind of visual reimagining of history. And with the film works I've been doing, I wanted to animate, in a way, the still photographs, and also try to begin to think about what might history sound like sonically. What's the sonic sound? What might be the sound? And not the literal sound, but how to amplify and evoke the sound of history. So Imani Uzuri, who I collaborated on Evergreen with, the vocal tradition and the song tradition of the antebellum era is actually her area of research and performance. So she was pretty much a natural choice to collaborate with that on, to kind of make the unheard presences in that three-channel piece kind of rise up from the ground, so to speak, and take on a sonic presence. With 350,000, it was a very different challenge.
That's the Richmond.
Imani composed the score looking at the three-channel piece when it was completed. Gaynell was actually conceptualizing and performing and recording that score, even as I was still out with the film crew making it. And it was the first time that she, as a choreographer, because my first conversation about collaborating with her, she said, "Oh, you're going to be filming me dancing." And I said, "Actually, no. You're not going to be seen, you're going to be heard." And I wanted the sonic landscape for that to come out of the imagined cumulative sound of 350,000 pairs of feet moving through that space. If we could layer that, overdub, 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 and layer the imagined sound of 350,000 pairs of feet, as well as the ambient sounds of the space, as well as some of the sounds that begin to emerge out of that tradition of Africans in America, and body slaps and hand bone and dancing and rhythm, to kind of take all of that and create a sonic landscape that never loses sight of those 350,000 pairs of feet, but then layers it into this complex sound of history. So it was certainly for me, as I continue doing film work and become more comfortable with, first of all, the collaborative nature of it.
Well, she then works with a number of dancers. She works with some of her students, dance students at VCU, who then become collaborators in the piece, but again, they're not seen. So you brought them in a challenging way. There's an intimacy of their presence in the work and yet not seen.
Yeah, and I had the good fortune that in Richmond, Virginia, there was an extraordinary recording studio in your ear, and a fantastic sound engineer Paul Brewski, who's a sound designer and a recording engineer. And we used the studio literally as a studio to begin making the work, recording in the Foley pit, and then overdubbing, and then me and Ganell sitting down listening to it with Brewski, and just building the sonic landscape in the studio, which, when joined with the two-channel film work, would do what I often refer to as 2 + 2 = 500. Something much more than either one alone could do. So I've become much more comfortable and confident in stretching out on the filmmaking process and becoming comfortable in conveying my ideas to others, because this is ultimately my work that I'm trying to shape, but I need to do it with and through both the cinematographer, both the editor, the Steadicam operator, there's a whole crew, and then there's the studio. And I've become much more comfortable both working and thinking in that kind of space.
As a musician yourself, as a drummer,
that's
in
a whole
your early
other
days,
conversation.
do you get a certain satisfaction from the arrival of sound and music in your work now?
Yeah, certainly. Whenever I have a good film crew that I'm working with, and this has been true even for the film that I did in Birmingham, 9/15/63, it always feels to me like I'm back in a good band. You know, that's the only analogy that I have for it. It feels like I'm back in a good band and we're making something. And everything is in sync. It feels good. It turns out the Steadicam operator on the Birmingham video actually was a bass player. So, yeah, that I guess is a whole other conversation. But my background in music certainly gives me the comfort of improvisation across all of this work, because I don't know what I'm going to find there. Yeah. But if you understand the form and the parameters, and you just start.
Well, when we were preparing for this conversation over at breakfast this morning, your instruction was improvise.
That's what we're going to do, man.
So we're going to take a couple of quick questions here. This one is from Kevin Claiborne, who I believe is the artist Kevin Claiborne, who says, regarding photos about the unseen, how do you define success and failure in the landscape series when making photographs about something unseen?
Well, there is success on my terms, and there is success in terms of how the viewer responds to the work. Certainly for the way I work and the way most photographers work within a certain tradition, a lot more photographs are made than are ever printed. The ones that are printed that come to public life are the ones that are the most successful, coherent representations of the idea. And it's any number of things. It's trying out different ideas. It's the difference between standing in front of a scene and making that photograph at, I don't know, I might as well go ahead and get technical, making it at f2.8 as opposed to f22. They're very different. F22 makes everything from the foreground to the background in focus, sharp, rich. It gives it a sense of, richly felt materiality. F2.8, just as an example, would give me the ability to isolate sharply one particular piece of it. But because I want to make this work about the entirety of the space. So there's the technical decisions. But success for me has to do with realizing all of the things that I attempted to do in the photograph, understanding that each photograph is, in a way, even if they're related, a new construction in and of itself. So I look for formal coherence first and foremost. How this thing coheres within the flat, two-dimensional, four-sided space that is the space that I work in. So it has to be a formal coherence. And then how you can move things around and how you can, continue to enliven that space. Even if the narrative is what underpins it, but how can you continue to engage a place and not make the same photograph again and yet again?
So to riff.
I start with formal coherence. It has to cohere formally, and then it just has to resonate, and it has to have the satisfaction of doing well, something I hadn't attempted to do before.
So to riff off of Kevin Claiborne's question about the unseen, do you think that you are showing the unseen, or are you helping us think about the unseen wherever it may reside?
I think both, because I believe it's there. I make photographs about things that I don't see, and I want to compel you to believe that they're there as well. Certainly, certainly, context has something to do with that. The way the work is framed. But I want the viewer to be able to begin to see the thing that they, in the absence of these photographs, they might not see, and to invest in that deeply. And I want the viewer to have an emotional experience. It's not meant to be a dry recitation of anything. I really want the viewer to have a very deeply felt experience about both the place and about the history that these photographs of place are about.
So we have a few questions here that actually go straight to matters that we have discussed already. So I hope the people asking those questions will forgive us for not going to them, since it's pretty much covered. But there's one that I think I'd like to end on, because it gets to, you'll see why as I read it. It's a slightly long question. It's very beautifully written by Diallo Simon Ponte. Forgive me if I haven't pronounced your last name correctly, but I'm going to read it. I'm thinking about the responsibility to the ancestors that you feel in the work, and wonder if, via your relationship to the image of the young Collins girl with bandages over her eyes, a responsibility was instigated within you to see things she could no longer see and tell stories she may no longer be able to witness. I'm wondering if that is something you've thought about. That moment feels like an inheritance of sorts.
Well, thank you. Whoever you are, I'm going to read something from the book in response to that. So on the first page, I've written, this work is for the ancestors, that their memory is not forgotten, and that they be brought forth into our present conversations. May they be honored and pleased by this work on their behalf. So this is ancestor work.
This is ancestor work.
Yeah, this is what I do. I'm doing ancestor work. you know, you know, that doesn't always come up in a conversation about photography and art. But yeah, I'm doing ancestor work. I have a very deep background in traditional West African music, culture. I've performed for traditional West African ritual ceremonies. I'm a very deep believer that our ancestors are present. We are here because of them, and we owe them that respect. We owe it to them to, in whatever platforms we have, to invoke their memories, that they not be forgotten. So whoever asked that question, I'm doing ancestor work. That's what I do.
So may the ancestors be pleased with us, be pleased with this work, be pleased with you, be pleased with all of us as we go out and try to continue to do this work under the conditions that currently prevail. Thank you so much, Dawoud.
Thank you.
Thank you for this time.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank all of you. Thank you.
I believe there's going to be book signing. Book signing is going to be happening over there.